This house no longer belongs to you, Mom. You should leave. My father's voice echoed through the long hallway, washed in the cold, golden light of the 32nd floor. And in that moment, it felt as if the entire building had stopped breathing. He didn't shout. He didn't tremble. He didn't lose control. It was precisely the way he spoke, too calm, too certain, too cold, that made the words more frightening than any outburst of anger. I was standing across the street, beneath a maple tree, just beginning to turn its early autumn colors, looking up at the gleaming glass facade of the Ashford Heights Tower. From where I stood, I couldn't hear every word drifting down, but I could clearly see my father, Victor Carter, blocking the entrance to the penthouse. He was wearing a brand new navy suit, the kind he only wore for extremely important occasions. Weddings, graduations, or corporate events where he wanted everyone to see him as a successful man. In his hand was a thick stack of legal documents. Beside him stood my mother, Elaine Carter, her back straight, one hand holding her purse while the other lightly dangled a newly replaced set of apartment keys. Her lips curved into a thin, sharp smile filled with quiet triumph. Behind them stood two lawyers, a building manager, and two police officers, waiting for the woman who had lived there for more than 20 years to be thrown out of her own home. That woman was my grandmother, Jasmine Carter, 76 years old, the woman who had spent half her life building everything, the woman I had always believed, no matter how the world turned its back on her, would always have her family as the last place she could return to. But it turned out the place that hurt her most in the end was also her family. I remember very clearly the moment the elevator doors opened. Grandma stepped out, wearing a cream-colored coat that fell to her knees. Her silver hair was neatly brushed back, and she carried the small leather handbag she always used when going out. From a distance, she didn't look like someone who had just returned from a long vacation. She stood straighter, calmer, as if she had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. My father stepped forward. My mother tilted her head, looking at her with a carefully crafted expression of pity. And then my father said those words, "This house no longer belongs to you, Mom. You should leave." I think if it had been anyone else, they would have panicked. They would have shouted. They would have trembled, protested, cried that this was absurd. But my grandmother didn't. She simply looked at my father for a long time, without blinking, without speaking immediately. Then she smiled faintly. It wasn't a happy smile. It wasn't a sad smile. It was the smile of someone who had finally seen exactly what she had predicted all along. "Victor," she said softly, her voice as light as wind, yet strong enough to silence everyone around us. "I knew you would do this. That's why I never truly left the city." The moment I heard that, the blood in my veins seemed to freeze, because I understood, and I knew that what was about to happen next would no longer be just another family argument. It would be the moment when every mask finally fell away. If you have ever believed that family would never betray you in the cruelest possible way, I believed that once too. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 28 years old, an elementary school teacher. I live in Brook Hollow, about 40 minutes outside the city. And 3 months before that moment, if someone had looked me straight in the eye and told me that my parents would conspire to seize my grandmother's property, force her out of the home she had protected for half her life, and even bring fake documents and the police to do it, I would have laughed in their face. I would have said it was impossible, not because my parents were perfect, but because I believed there were lines that no one, no matter how desperate, would ever cross. I was wrong. If I had to choose one word to describe my grandmother Jasmine, it would be steadfast. Not strong in the loud, dramatic way that immediately intimidates people. She never needed that. Her strength was quieter. It lived in the way she walked into a room, and somehow everything naturally fell into order. In the way she listened to others finish speaking before responding with one short sentence that always struck the heart of the matter. In the way she had survived so many storms in life, that pain no longer knocked her down, it only deepened the calm in her eyes. She was born in Willow Creek, a place she once described to me like this. In winter, it got so cold, the water in the basin froze. In summer, red dust climbed all the way up to the curtains. Her family was poor, not the romantic kind of poverty you read about in stories. Real poverty. Clothes patched again and again. Meals carefully measured. Dreams, sometimes treated like luxuries. She often said she never had the kind of youth people look back on with nostalgic smiles. Her youth was work, waiting tables until midnight, doing bookkeeping for extra pay on weekends, studying accounting at night with burning eyes from exhaustion, swallowing insults and condescension because she needed money more than she needed her pride soothed. Later, after marrying my grandfather, the two of them started a small transportation company together. At first, it was nothing more than a few minor contracts, one old truck, a rented warehouse, and countless sleepless nights. Slowly, it grew. More trucks, more employees, more partners, more routes, more profit, but also more risk, more pressure, more decisions where a single mistake could destroy everything. My grandfather passed away fairly early. Many people believed the company would collapse without him. They were wrong. My grandmother took over, not with tears, but with the kind of cold discipline that refused to let her fall apart. She learned to read contracts the way others read intentions. She memorized numbers that mattered. She watched people long enough to see what they were hiding. And most importantly, she learned never to wait for anyone to save her. By the time she turned 60, she sold most of her shares in the company. She kept an investment fund, several properties, a steady income, more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, and the penthouse on the 32nd floor of Ashford Heights. That penthouse was more than a home. It was the reward for a lifetime of refusing to surrender. 3 spacious bedrooms, a private office overlooking the city, bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling filled with history, biographies, economics, and philosophy. Old landscape paintings, a brown leather sofa that had been there since the day she moved in, and a heavy mahogany desk she once said she would never replace, no matter how much someone offered for it. I loved that home growing up, not because it was luxurious, but because every corner of it carried her spirit. The faint scent of black tea in the kitchen each morning, the steady ticking of an antique clock in the hall, the golden afternoon sunlight falling across the cream-colored carpet in the living room, and my grandmother always seated by the window with reading glasses on the tip of her nose, holding a black fountain pen as she wrote notes into a leather journal. To me, she was more than just a grandmother. She was the person who taught me that a woman does not have to raise her voice to be powerful, that kindness does not mean stupidity, and that dignity can keep a person standing tall even when their heart is quietly breaking. Nếu bạn muốn, tôi có thể dịch tiếp toàn bộ các phần 212 sang tiếng Anh, hoàn chỉnh theo phong cách kịch bản. YouTube rất mượt để đọc voice. Bạn đầy đủ có thể đạt khoảng 7,88 tiêu chuẩn storytelling giống kịch bản bạn đang xây dựng. My parents lived in Maple Grove, a 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood with a white fence in front and a patch of lawn just large enough for my father to feel proud every weekend when he trimmed it. There were always 2 clean cars in the garage. There was always fruit arranged neatly in a ceramic bowl in the kitchen. There was always a thin blanket folded carefully over the back of the living room sofa. I used to think that was what stability looked like. My father, Victor Carter, was the kind of man who hated failure. He didn't talk much about feelings. He wasn't the kind of father who hugged his children often, ruffled their hair, or showed tenderness in ways people easily notice. But he was always on time. He always paid tuition bills in full. He always changed broken light bulbs himself. He always checked the tire pressure before long drives. He loved the way he knew how, practically, rigidly, responsibly. My mother, Elaine Carter, seemed softer on the surface. She knew how to say the right things in front of other people. She knew how to create the impression of being a thoughtful mother, a capable wife, a woman who kept her home in perfect order. From childhood into adulthood, I never once imagined she could be cruel. Difficult? Yes. Controlling? Absolutely. Too concerned with appearances? Definitely. But cruel? At least that was what I used to believe. My father worked as a financial manager for a supply company. My mother worked in human resources for a service firm. They weren't rich, but they weren't poor either. They lived within their means. They spent carefully. If finances allowed, they took a summer trip to Seabrook once a year. Sometimes they went out for dinner on anniversaries. I thought they were content with that life. Not glamorous, not remarkable, but solid. The reason I believed my parents still had self-respect was simple. They had never openly asked my grandmother for money. Of course, she had helped in small ways over the years, larger than usual Christmas gifts, paying for a course for me when I was younger, little things like that. But my father always kept his distance from her wealth. Whenever anyone mentioned inheritance or family assets, he usually withdrew, visibly annoyed. Mom's money is mom's money, he had once said. I don't live off other people. That was why what happened later was so hard to accept. Because betrayal from a person who has always been greedy is terrifying. But betrayal from someone you believed had principles, that is what truly crushes trust. It all started in February. My father's company restructured, then partially collapsed, then sent out a cold email on a Friday afternoon announcing layoffs for more than 100 employees. My father was on that list. He came home that evening with a pale face, but still tried to appear calm. It's only a temporary setback, he said during a family dinner that none of us could really eat. I have experience. I'll find something new soon. I believed him. My mother did too, or at least she wanted to act as if she did. During the first week, my father still wore a pressed shirt every morning, got up on schedule, sat in front of his laptop, and sent out job applications like a man still in control of the situation. By the second week, he had become quieter. By the third, I noticed the dark circles under his eyes. By the fourth, my mother had started snapping over small things, an electric bill up a few dollars, a dripping kitchen faucet, groceries costing more than expected. Then the second month passed. No solid offers, no good opportunities, no company truly eager to hire a man in his 50s with a high salary expectation, deep experience, and not enough of the flexibility younger companies claim to value. Their savings began to thin. The mortgage pressed harder. Insurance, old tuition-related expenses, credit card bills, car payments, daily living costs, everything stacked on top of everything else like stones growing heavier by the day. One evening, when I stopped by Maple Grove, I noticed a letter from the bank lying open on the table. A warning, a formal notice about the next steps if the loan was not brought current. My mother folded it shut the second she saw me looking, but it was too late. I had already seen enough. And around that same time, I began noticing something else. My father started mentioning my grandmother more often. At first, it sounded casual. Mom must get lonely in that big penthouse by herself. She's getting older. It would probably be good if family were nearby. People her age need company. On the surface, none of those things sounded wrong. But the look in his eyes every time he said them unsettled me. It no longer felt like the concern of a son worried about his mother. It felt like the gaze of a man calculating the distance between his hardship and somebody else's wealth. I tried to push that feeling away, because I didn't want to believe it. Because sometimes the truth is so ugly that the mind protects itself by refusing to see it. One evening near the end of March, my mother called me. Emma, come home this weekend. Your father and I need to discuss something. Her voice sounded tense, but strangely bright too, the kind of brightness people have when they think they've found a way out. When I arrived, the table had already been set. It wasn't a warm family dinner. It felt like a meeting. A laptop was already open. A thick stack of paperwork sat beside a glass of water. My father sat at the head of the table with the serious expression of a man preparing to present a business plan. Sit down, Emma, he said. So I did. He turned the screen toward me. It was an Excel sheet filled with numbers. Mortgage, utilities, insurance, credit cards, car loan, living expenses, medication, several smaller debts that together had become something enormous. The final column was highlighted in red. $4,800 a month. We can't keep going like this much longer, my father said. If we don't figure something out in the next 60 days, things will get very bad. I knew they were under pressure, but seeing it laid out that clearly still made my throat tighten. My mother took a breath and leaned forward. We've come up with a solution. I looked at her. We're moving in with Grandma Jasmine. It took me a few seconds to fully process what she had said. Into the penthouse? My father nodded. I already spoke to Mom. She agreed. Did she really agree? She agreed, he repeated. She said living alone in a place that big gets lonely. And she's older now. Having family around would make the place feel warmer. My mother quickly added, Exactly. It's better for her to have someone nearby taking care of her. Honestly, this is good for everyone. Everyone. I hated the way she said that word. But, I said slowly, Grandma is used to her own routine. Is she actually comfortable with this? She'll adjust, my father answered. My mother smiled, trying to soothe me. Emma, you know how older people are. What they value most is family close by, and Grandma only has your father as her child. If we stand by her during this stage of life, she'll appreciate it. I stared at her. She saw on my face that I understood what she really meant, but she kept going anyway, lightly, almost casually. Besides, one day everything she has is going to stay in the family anyway. The air in the room collapsed. I turned to my father. He didn't object. He didn't frown. He didn't tell her to stop. He just sat there in silence, as if what she had said was perfectly reasonable. Dad, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, Grandma is still healthy, and that's her property. She has the right to do whatever she wants. Of course she does, he said quickly. I never said otherwise. I'm just saying that if we're there for her, if we take care of her, then that's the right thing to do. She'll value that. But I could hear the thing hidden beneath his tone. Not devotion. Not filial love. Expectation. Expectation of a reward. That night, driving back to Brook Hollow, I felt as if my chest were full of stone. I had no real proof, only instinct. But sometimes a woman's instinct is the only thing standing between her and disaster. A month later, my parents officially moved into the penthouse. 3 days after the last boxes had been brought in, my grandmother called me. Emma, come by this weekend. The house feels livelier now. Her voice was as gentle as always, but beneath it I heard something thin and worn, something tired. I came on Saturday afternoon. My mother opened the door with a bright smile I hadn't seen in a long time. Emma, you're here. Come in. I'm baking using Grandma's old recipe. The smell of butter, sugar, and chocolate drifted out from the kitchen. If all you had to judge by was that smell, you would have thought it was an ordinary family gathering. But it wasn't. The moment I stepped inside, I stopped. The soft, cream-colored hallway walls had been painted a cold gray. The landscape painting of Willow Creek that used to hang by the entrance was gone. The old crystal chandelier had been replaced by a sleek, modern fixture. Pretty, isn't it? My mother asked when she noticed me looking around. I thought the place needed a more modern feel. Grandma agreed to all this? My mother shrugged. She said we could do whatever looked nice. She's old now. She doesn't really care about these things anymore. The word sent a chill over my skin. My grandmother was not someone who didn't care. That home, to her, was discipline, memory, a lifetime of careful order. If she had gone quiet, that didn't mean she felt nothing. Sometimes silence only means a person is too tired to fight. I walked into the living room. The familiar brown leather sofa was gone. The oak bookshelves had been pushed off to one side. A new glass display cabinet stood in the middle of the room, filled with fashion magazines, strange decorative vases, and cold little objects that had no soul and didn't belong there. Where's Grandma? I asked. In her office, my mother said. She spends most of her time in there. I guess she still hasn't gotten used to having more people around. She smiled lightly, but there was no real sympathy in that smile. I knocked on the office door. Come in. My grandmother was sitting behind her mahogany desk, one hand resting on a journal. Light from the large window fell across her shoulder, making her face look both gentler and more exhausted than I remembered. When she saw me, her eyes brightened. Emma. I crossed the room quickly and hugged her, and in that moment, I realized she had lost weight. Are you okay? I'm fine, she said, then smiled in the way people do when they are trying to comfort someone else. It's just more change than I expected. You can tell them you don't like it. She glanced toward the door and lowered her voice. Your parents are struggling. I don't want to become the bitter mother who closes her door on her son. Victor is my only child. Then she stopped. And yet, she said quietly, sometimes I feel as if I'm living in someone else's house. I didn't know what to say, because I had already started feeling exactly the same thing. 2 weeks later, my phone rang close to midnight. The screen showed Grandma Jasmine. I answered almost immediately. Emma, could you come here? Her voice was low, small, and serious enough that I didn't ask a single question. I just grabbed my keys and drove. When I arrived at Ashford Heights, the hallway on the 32nd floor was unusually quiet. My parents were asleep. My grandmother opened the door wearing an ivory robe, her silver hair tied low at the nape of her neck. She wasn't panicked. She was intensely, sharply calm. She led me into her office and closed the door. Then she opened the drawer on the right side of her desk. I keep all the important papers here, she said. My will, the trust documents, property records, the things I never leave lying around. I looked at the neat stack of documents inside. Tonight, I realized the lock had been tampered with. I looked up at her. Are you sure? She nodded. I picked up a habit back when I was running the company. Whenever I stored important papers, I left a small sign that no one else would notice. In this drawer, I placed a thin thread along the edge. Tonight, it had shifted, and the papers were no longer in the exact order I left them. My heart began to pound, heavy and hard. Did you ask Mom and Dad? Not yet. She looked straight at me. I wanted to be certain first. But Emma, she paused, and in her eyes I saw something I almost never saw there. Pain. Not because of the money. Not because of the penthouse. But because the person she was beginning to suspect was her own son. I'm afraid Victor is planning something. I sat down in the chair across from her. What has he asked you? Lately, he's asked many questions about ownership, about beneficiaries, about what happens if an older person begins to show signs of cognitive decline, who gets the right to manage the estate. The questions are too specific, too frequent, too deliberate. The room seemed to tilt. What do you want me to do? She reached over and placed her hand gently over mine. Watch. Visit more often. Notice what they do, and don't let them know I'm suspicious. That night, driving home, I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. The tears just kept coming. Because there are moments in life when you realize you have crossed through a door. And from that point on, you will never be innocent in quite the same way again. After that night, I began visiting the penthouse more often. Sometimes I told myself maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe the stress had made all of us suspicious. Maybe this was one long misunderstanding that would eventually fall apart on its own. I wanted to believe that. I truly did. But then one small detail after another began to pile up. One afternoon, I passed by my parents' bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I heard my father speaking softly on the phone. Right. And if the property owner is elderly and shows mild confusion, then an immediate family member can petition for oversight, correct? I froze. No one in that house showed mild confusion. My grandmother remembered names, dates, and stock figures better than most younger people I knew. Another time, I caught my mother using the scanner in Grandma's office. When I asked what she was doing, she answered immediately. Your grandmother asked me to make copies of a few papers. But that night, when I sat in the kitchen with Grandma and casually brought it up, she turned and looked at me. I never asked her to. The most frightening moment came on a rainy afternoon. I walked into the kitchen to get some water and noticed a scrap of paper on the counter, scribbled in blue pen. Real estate attorney, power of attorney, cognitive evaluation, signature, risk, 3 months. I took a picture of it immediately. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to hold the phone with both hands. That night, I sent the photo to Grandma. 10 minutes later, she called. Her voice was strangely calm. Emma, I need you to keep this quiet. What are you going to do? I'm going to leave for a while. Why? If you know what they're planning, why not confront them now? She was silent for 2 seconds. Then she said something I never forgot. Because some people only reveal who they really are when they believe no one is watching anymore. I stood in my small apartment in Brook Hollow, staring at my reflection in the dark window. You're setting a trap? No, she said softly. I'm simply giving the truth a chance to walk out into the open on its own. A week later, during dinner, my grandmother made the announcement. I'm going to Europe for a few months. I'll visit an old friend in Ireland first, then maybe France and Italy. I need some rest. I looked up immediately. Even though I had known the plan beforehand, my heart still began to race when I heard her say it out loud in front of my parents. My father hesitated, only for a second. My mother did too. Just one glance between them, but it was enough. I saw it. Opportunity? How long will you be gone? My father asked, trying to sound casual. 2 months, maybe 3. It's not safe to travel alone at your age, my mother said, with nearly flawless concern. Do you want me to arrange someone to go with you? Grandma smiled faintly. I'm still capable of boarding a plane by myself. The entire table went still. That wasn't an innocent comment. It was a warning, and I saw in my parents' eyes that they understood it. 2 days later, my father drove her to the airport. When he returned to the penthouse, I was already there. He walked in, looking visibly relieved. She boarded, he told my mother in the kitchen. unaware that I was standing in the hallway. "We have time." But what my father didn't know
See,
was
sun is
this.
going down.
My grandmother never boarded that plane. Her driver took her to the airport. She went through every visible motion of a departure. Then she quietly exited through another gate and left.
Sun is going.
She rented a small
It's going
apartment
behind
in
the
Silver
mountains.
Pines, less than 10 minutes from Ashford Heights. And there, she met with a man named Adrian Cole. I had heard Grandma mention Adrian before, an old contact from the finance world, someone who specialized in internal investigations and fraud cases where one wrong step could cost millions. He wasn't physically imposing in any dramatic way, but he had the eyes of a man who had spent his life looking straight through lies. That evening, Grandma called me from the apartment in Silver Pines. "Emma, from now on, everything has to look natural. You still visit the penthouse as usual. You still have dinner with your parents. You behave as though you know nothing. And Adrian, he'll help me gather evidence." I went quiet, then finally said the thing that had been lodged in my throat the whole time. "You're investigating your own son." On the other end of the line, I heard her exhale slowly. "No, Emma. I'm protecting myself from people who have already decided they no longer see me as their mother." Those next 3 months were the worst period of my life. I went to the penthouse every week, sometimes twice. I sat at the dinner table with my parents, as if I had never overheard their plans. I smiled when my mother asked about school. I washed dishes with my father. I helped reorganize the kitchen cabinets. I listened to them talk about how Grandma was enjoying Europe as if it were just another harmless family story. But inside me, nothing was the same. Every sentence made me wonder what hidden meaning sat underneath it. Every document left too casually on a table made my pulse jump. Every smile from my parents no longer looked innocent. I couldn't tell whether it was real happiness or the satisfaction of people who believed they were getting closer to what they wanted. I started keeping records. Dates, times, who said what, when they went out, what papers they carried, who came by. Adrian handled the rest. He found out that my father had been meeting with a lawyer who specialized in disputes involving elderly property holders downtown. He found out my mother had met with a man known for handling difficult paperwork, the kind of euphemism people use for forged documents. He discovered my parents had gone to a notary office twice in the same week. He traced cash withdrawals, appointments, emails with vague wording, but enough detail to connect the pieces into something unmistakable. And the clearer that picture became, the more disgusting it was. My father was asking how to petition for control of assets if the owner showed signs of cognitive decline. My mother was discussing the need for a professional evaluation that would make the case look convincing. At one point, Adrian even let me hear part of a recording from a meeting between my mother and the man handling the paperwork. "This signature needs to look closer," my mother said on the recording. "It only has to get past the first stage." My hands went cold listening to it. I no longer recognized that woman. The woman who once tied my hair before school. The woman who held my hand at my first school performance. The woman who hugged me when I got my heart broken at 20. That person was still there. But somehow greed had swallowed her so completely that she had become a stranger in front of her own daughter. I thought the worst thing would be seeing undeniable proof that my parents were forging documents. It wasn't. The worst thing happened one late afternoon, when I arrived at the penthouse earlier than usual and accidentally saw my father sitting alone in the living room with several sheets of practice paper. He was copying my grandmother's signature. Slowly, carefully, patiently. He shaped each line with the concentration of a man doing delicate work, not a man preparing to steal his mother's home. I stood behind the wall, barely able to breathe, and in that moment, something inside me died completely. Not love, not memory, but faith. The faith that maybe they would stop before it was too late. They would not stop. They had already gone too far to turn around. That same evening, I heard my mother say in the kitchen, her tone light and calm, as if she were discussing weekend plans. "Just a few more weeks, then everything will be fine. Fine." I lay awake that entire night, staring at the ceiling in my apartment and asking myself one question over and over again. What kind of story does a person have to tell themselves in order to call stealing an old woman's home "everything will be fine"? By the end of the 3rd month, everything was finished. My parents completed the transfer documents, with a forged signature, with fabricated supporting records, with a fake cognitive evaluation designed to make my grandmother appear like someone no longer capable of managing her own life. On paper, The penthouse had been transferred into their names. What chilled me most was not that they had managed to go that far. It was the way they behaved afterward. No fear, no remorse, only relief, the quiet satisfaction of people who believed they had successfully completed something difficult. That same evening, they sent my grandmother an email. It was short. Mom, we've arranged everything, so you no longer have to worry about the apartment. Enjoy your time in Europe. We'll handle the rest here. No request for permission. No explanation. No question. Just a simple announcement that they had taken her home. 10 minutes later, my grandmother called me. Her voice didn't shake. It wasn't angry either. It carried only a stillness, so sharp it almost felt cold. Emma, it's time. I'm coming back. Are you ready? Silence for a second. Then she said very softly, No one is ever ready for their own child to betray them, but I am ready for the truth to be seen. The night before Grandma's return from Europe, I barely slept. I lay there watching the minutes change on the clock. Outside my window, the wind moved through the dark trees. Inside my head, I kept seeing my parents standing in front of the penthouse door, convinced that at last they had succeeded. And then I thought about Grandma, a 76-year-old woman who had spent her whole life surviving loss, building, sacrificing, protecting, preserving, only to find herself in a position where she had to prove to her own son that she still owned the home she lived in. There is no tragedy sadder than a family tragedy. Because when love once existed and still is not strong enough to stop greed, the wound cuts deeper than anything else. That morning was a beautiful Saturday, in the most merciless way. The sky was clear. Sunlight poured gold across the glass sides of the surrounding towers. The city below the penthouse moved as usual, busy, loud, indifferent, completely unaware that on the 32nd floor a family was about to tear itself open. My parents woke up early. My mother wore an elegant cream-colored dress, the kind that made her look composed, graceful, trustworthy. My father wore the same suit I had already seen him prepare. They changed the locks one final time, laid out the transfer papers, contacted a moving service. They had even researched high-end retirement homes, as if forcing my grandmother out of her own house and placing her somewhere more suitable for her age could somehow be called compassion. Around 10 that morning, my father received a text message. 15 minutes. She's on her way. My mother smiled faintly. It's time to perform. I stood there in the living room trying not to be sick. I had hoped that at the final moment, maybe one of them would panic. Maybe one of them would hesitate. Maybe one of them would wake up. But no, they were too calm, too decisive, too certain of victory. At 11:10, the elevator doors opened, and my grandmother stepped out. She wore a cream-colored coat that fell neatly to her knees. Her silver hair was brushed back, elegant as ever. One hand held the small leather handbag she always carried. She did not look like a woman coming home from a long vacation. She looked like a woman walking into a room where she already knew exactly what she would find. My father immediately stepped forward. My mother tilted her head, carefully arranging that same false look of pity. The lawyers straightened. The building manager shifted his weight. The police officers remained still, waiting. And then my father spoke. This house no longer belongs to you, Mom. You should leave. The hallway seemed to freeze around the words. I think if it had been anyone else, the shock alone would have broken them. Anyone else might have shouted, might have pleaded, might have stared in disbelief and demanded an explanation. But not Jasmine Carter. My grandmother simply looked at my father, long and steadily, without blinking, without hurrying. Then she smiled, just a little. It was not a smile of joy. It was not even a smile of pain. It was the smile of someone watching a lie finally reach the end of its own rope. Victor, she said, her voice quiet but clear enough that no one there could pretend not to hear it. I knew you would do this. That is why I never truly left the city. The silence that followed was enormous. I watched my father's face change. Only slightly, but enough. Enough for me to see the first crack of uncertainty. My mother's fingers tightened around her purse. What are you talking about? She asked quickly, too quickly. Grandma turned her gaze toward her. I'm talking about the fact that I never went to Europe. She paused. I'm talking about the forged documents, the fake evaluation, the copied signatures, the meetings with lawyers, the altered records, the locks you changed in my home. My father's face drained of color. For a moment, nobody moved. Then my mother gave a small laugh, one that sounded brittle, almost desperate. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Victor, say something. She's confused." Confused. That word, the very word they had been preparing to weaponize against her. And that was when another elevator opened. A man stepped out, tall, composed, wearing a dark coat, holding a leather folder under one arm. Adrian Cole. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He simply walked toward us with the precise calm of someone bringing facts into a room full of lies. Behind him came another attorney, and one more uniformed officer. Adrian stopped beside my grandmother and looked directly at my father. "I'm Adrian Cole," he said evenly. "I represent Mrs. Jasmine Carter. We have documentation, recordings, witness statements, financial records, and forensic handwriting analysis. We also have evidence of attempted fraud, document forgery, unlawful transfer of property, and conspiracy to exploit an elderly owner." No one spoke. It was as if the air itself had been knocked out of the hallway. My father stared at him, then at Grandma, then back again. "That's absurd," he said at last. But his voice no longer had its old certainty. "This is a misunderstanding." "No," my grandmother said softly. "It's betrayal." The word landed harder than a shout. My mother tried to recover first. "Jasmine, please," she said, switching instantly into a trembling, injured tone. "We were trying to help you. We thought—" "You thought," Grandma interrupted, "that if I were far enough away, old enough, and alone enough, you could take what I built and call it care." Elaine's face changed. "Not much, but enough. Enough for all the sweetness to disappear." My father finally took a step forward. "Mom, listen to me." "No," Grandma said. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't need to. That single word stopped him cold. Then she reached into her bag and removed a small envelope. She held it out, not to him, but to the lawyer standing beside Adrian. "Please." He took it, opened it, and removed certified copies of the original trust documents and ownership records. Adrian turned one page after another, with slow precision. "The penthouse remains legally owned by Mrs. Jasmine Carter," he said. "The attempted transfer is invalid. The signature does not match. The evaluation was falsified. The notary procedure is under review, and this entire matter has already been reported." The building manager's expression shifted instantly. Until that moment, he had been standing there under the assumption that my parents were carrying out a lawful transfer. Now he looked at them differently. The officers did too. Not as respectable adults handling a delicate family issue, but as possible criminals. I stood a few feet away, hardly breathing. Not because I didn't understand what was happening, but because I did. I understood every second of it. This was the moment my parents realized they had not cornered an old woman. They had exposed themselves. My father looked at me then, and I will never forget that look. Not anger first. Not shame first. Panic. Because in that instant, he understood something else too. He understood that I had known. Maybe not from the beginning, but long enough to stand with her instead of with him. "Emma," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded strange, almost unreal. "You knew about this?" I felt something inside me tremble. Because no matter what he had done, he was still my father. And there are some wounds that cut even while you are doing the right thing. But I looked at him and answered with the only truth I had left. "I knew enough." His face hardened. My mother stared at me as if I had become something unrecognizable. "You chose her over us?" she whispered. And I remember the shock that rose in me then, not because she said it, but because she truly believed that was the question. As if loyalty meant helping them destroy someone weaker. As if blood erased morality. As if being their daughter required me to stand beside cruelty. I looked at my mother and said quietly, "No. I chose what was right over what was wrong." She flinched. Maybe because it was the truth. Maybe because deep down, some part of her had always known exactly what she was doing. The officers began speaking with Adrian and the attorney. The building manager stepped away to make calls. One of the lawyers my parents had brought looked furious. Furious not at the crime, but at being dragged into a situation that was suddenly collapsing. My father tried one last time. "Mom," he said, and for the first time all morning, there was desperation in his voice. "Please, don't do this." My grandmother looked at him with an expression I still struggled to describe. Not hatred, not vengeance, just the exhausted sorrow of a woman who had reached the end of what she could excuse. You already did this, Victor, she said. You did it when you practiced my signature. You did it when you changed the locks. You did it when you decided my old age made me easier to erase. You did it when you stopped seeing me as your mother and started seeing me as an obstacle. No one spoke after that, because what answer could possibly exist for words like those? My mother began crying then. Not the shattered crying of someone destroyed by guilt, the sharper kind, the kind that comes when a plan falls apart and humiliation arrives before remorse. She kept saying, we were desperate, and maybe they were. Maybe they truly had been terrified of losing their house, their savings, their life as they knew it. But desperation explains a choice. It does not cleanse it. Not when the choice was this deliberate. Not when it required weeks of planning, forged documents, lies, and the willingness to throw a 76-year-old woman out of her own home. At some point, one of the officers asked my parents to step aside. My father looked as though he wanted to argue, but Adrian was already producing more documentation, more evidence, more proof. The kind of proof that doesn't care how respectable you look in a suit. And just like that, the performance ended. The carefully chosen clothes, the legal papers in neat folders, the officers they had expected to use as witnesses to my grandmother's humiliation. Everything had turned. All of it. I stood there and suddenly realized I was shaking. Not from fear anymore, from release. 3 months of silence. 3 months of pretending. 3 months of sitting at tables and swallowing rage and grief and disbelief. And now the truth was finally standing in the open, where everyone could see it. Grandma turned to me then, only for a second. But in that second, I saw something in her eyes that nearly broke me. Not victory, not satisfaction, just pain mixed with relief. The pain of a mother who had been right, and the relief of a woman who no longer had to doubt herself. I walked to her side. My father watched me do it. My mother watched me do it. And I think that was the moment they both understood this wasn't something that would simply fade with time. Some acts divide a family for years. Some divide it forever. What they had done belonged to the second kind. Grandma reached for my hand. Her fingers were cool, but steady, very steady. And with the entire hallway still hushed around us, she said something so quietly that only I heard it. Thank you for believing me, before I had to beg. That sentence still lives inside me. Because that was the real heart of it, wasn't it? She should never have had to beg, not to stay in her own home, not to be treated as sane, not to be seen as human, not by strangers, and certainly not by her own family. Later, when the officers finished, when the lawyers were still arguing in clipped voices, when the building staff moved through the hall in tense silence, I stood by the windows of the penthouse and looked out over the city. Everything below continued as usual. Cars moved. People crossed streets. Sunlight flashed across distant buildings. The world had not changed, and yet mine had, because sometimes the end of a family does not come in one loud explosion. Sometimes it comes in signatures practiced on scrap paper, in locks changed quietly, in polite lies told over dinner. In the moment a son looks at his mother and decides her age makes her easier to steal from. That morning, my parents lost far more than a penthouse. They lost the right to call what they had done love. And my grandmother, standing in the home she had fought to protect, did not look powerful because she had won. She looked powerful because even after all of it, she was still standing straight, still speaking clearly, still refusing to let cruelty rewrite the truth of her life. That day taught me something I will carry for the rest of my life. Family is not sacred simply because it is family. A blood tie is not a free pass. And love without boundaries becomes the easiest doorway through which harm enters. Some people believe loyalty means enduring anything from the people who share your name. I don't believe that anymore. I believe loyalty without truth becomes complicity. I believe forgiveness is not the same thing as access. And I believe boundaries are not what destroy families. Betrayal does that. Greed does that. Cowardice does that. Boundaries are simply what remain when someone decides they will no longer participate in their own destruction. If you had asked me before all this whether I could ever stand against my own parents, I would have said no. Not because they were perfect, but because I thought love would always find a way back. Now I know better. Love can survive many things. Pride, distance, misunderstanding, even silence. But it cannot survive being used as a weapon. And that is what my parents did. They took the language of care, duty, family, concern, and used it to disguise theft. That was their real crime. Not only trying to steal a penthouse, but trying to make cruelty look like love. And perhaps that was why the truth needed to come out exactly the way it did. Publicly, clearly, with every mask falling in front of every witness. Because some lies are too polished to be broken in private. They need light. They need evidence. They need the exact moment when the people telling them realize they are no longer in control of the story. That was the moment I saw in my father's face when Grandma said, "I never truly left the city." That was the moment I saw in my mother's silence when Adrian opened the folder. That was the moment I felt in my own chest when I stepped to my grandmother's side and understood that grief and clarity can exist together. I lost my parents that day. Maybe not literally, maybe not in the official sense, but I lost the version of them I had loved. The version I had defended in my mind. The version I had tried so hard to preserve even when the evidence kept cutting through it. And in place of that loss, something harder was born. Not bitterness, something cleaner than that. Truth. The truth that sometimes the people who raised you are still capable of becoming the people you must protect others from. The truth that being a good daughter does not mean becoming a silent witness to injustice. And the truth that some homes are not protected by walls or locks or paperwork. They are protected by the one person willing to say, "No, this is wrong, and I will not help you do it." That person, in the end, was not my father, not my mother. It was my 76-year-old grandmother. And I think that is why, even now, when I remember that morning, I do not remember her as old. I remember her as unshakable. A woman in a cream-colored coat, standing in the cold gold light of the 32nd floor, looking straight at the people who tried to erase her, and refusing to disappear.